Welcome back to Freight Waves Now. It's Monday morning, which means that it is time to get a recap of last week's episode of Net Zero Carbon. We're here with Danny Gomez, one of the hosts today. Danny, thank you for joining us on this Monday.
How you guys doing?
Doing pretty good as usual, and we're missing Tyler, your partner in crime today, but that's okay. He's out on travel, and we can talk a little bit about what you guys chatted on last week's episode of Net Zero Carbon, all about offsets, which is a really hot topic right now in the net zero space.
Yeah, and I think there's a line, right? And some people are on the pro-offset side, and some people are on the wait and see side. And I think the thing that was interesting from the episode on Friday was that we are sending a clear signal by creating this demand for offsets. And what does that mean? That we have corporates that are out there saying we want to buy them and that we're willing to pay this price. And that signal sends to the developers, as a signal to the developers that, hey, they should be looking at investing in technologies and that they should feel comfortable that in doing so and investing in these projects that they'll have these buyers there ready to take ownership of the credits when they begin to mint them. And for those who aren't super familiar with how the offset market works, and really the goal of Friday's call or Friday's episode was to demystify some of this for people. Offsets are being used to offset the carbon that you emit from your business, the part of your business that you just can't abate. So the reality is, and I think we'll talk about this later today, there's a desire to reduce emissions, but in a lot of places, whether it's just the cooperation isn't there yet or the technology isn't there yet, we do need to start offsetting emissions sooner than we can wait for those technologies to get there. And so I think it's really important that the offset market exists. I think it does provide a really good service to the environment, which is a signal to these project developers who can then go out and, whether it's protecting deforestation, so making sure that trees aren't being cut down, or planting trees, or carbon capture. It's a really important part, and it's important that we fund the investments in this area.
And Danny, when we're looking at offsets, say, I'm just completely, new to this space and looking at it now, is this like a true commodity, or are they built differently? Are there levels to this? Are there some offsets that are more quality than others? Are there more initiatives that are higher than others? Or is there a ranking in this at all?
Yeah, and the price, you'll see it in the price, right? There's $5 offsets, and there's $1,000 offsets, and so there is a rank. What's happening right now is that the market's trying to provide some standardization. It's still very early days, but the point or the hope is that it becomes to function like a commodities market. You're starting to see a lot of exchanges pop up to provide pricing transparency and liquidity to these projects, and also the regulated exchanges who are coming and trying to launch futures contracts around offsets. So what's happening is that people start to plan to see what their exposure is in the coming years, and they can start to purchase ahead of time offsets, or they can mitigate that risk by trading futures contracts. But yes, to your point, this standardization is coming, and I think in the next 5-ish years, it'll start to feel more like a commodities market.
Special guest with us here from Convoy today. Before we get into that interview, I wanted to finish this up by talking about kind of looking at that future of offsets. And when you're your company and you're trying to estimate what you want to budget towards your offsets versus what you want to budget towards versus what you budget towards your emissions, it can be kind of tricky to do if you're looking pretty far down in the future, right? So strategies for companies trying to figure out where they can put their offsets, or where they can figure out how to fund their offsets. Do you have any advice on what metrics to start measuring first to kind of help you in that decision-making process of getting into offsets?
Yeah, we talk about it on the episode. So there's the goal of getting to net zero. So that means that you're reducing your emissions, where you're emitting zero for the business that you run. And then there's carbon neutral. And so one, I think, is getting the footprint. So going through your entire scopes of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So assets that you operate, energy that you use, and then third-party emissions, getting that footprint. And then what we talk about with Tyler a lot is that we don't yet have the tools to be super precise, or to be to have like take a scalpel to the problem, right? I think we're still using blunt tools. So I think step one is just measure. Understand that you can't get to net zero yet, but you can get to carbon neutral. So make some really, I think, concerted efforts to reduce your emissions. And then once you size how much carbon you can't reduce, then look to the market to fill that, so you can go out and purchase offsets to offset that emissions.
Awesome. And Danny, we have to, of course, transition and bring on our special guest. We have Brendan Deist, who's going to be joining us from Convoy. Brendan, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. And Brendan, you're one of the sustainability marketing specialists over at Convoy. And I'll let you and Danny kind of just get into this discussion about what's going on with a new white paper that you guys are releasing for FreightWaves.
Brendan, thanks for today. You're touching on a subject that, we've talked about for a while. Dan Lewis was the first guest we had on net zero carbon, and it's, he opened my eyes on that first interview. So for the benefit of those listening today, do you mind just talking about your passion about empty miles and the programs that you guys run in general?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so for us, empty miles are definitely a big thing that we focused on. So back in November of 2021, we actually launched our No Empty Miles campaign at FreightWaves F3. So we really have been focused on, one, bringing awareness to the supply chain all up, and then the freight industry really trying to bring awareness about the issue of no empty miles, and not only that it is an issue of reducing carbon emissions, but it's also an issue in terms of costs. So I think one thing that people think about when they think about empty miles is that it might be putting extra carbon emissions into the atmosphere. But I think especially what we're seeing right now with obviously the tragedy we're seeing in Ukraine, I think with rising gas prices, you're really starting to see a lot of these costs not only go to the truck drivers in forms of gas prices, but we're also seeing shippers paying a higher premium. And then ultimately that also goes on to the consumer too. So it's really interesting that empty miles are, one, a sustainability issue, but two, a cost issue as well.
So the report came out just recently, and we encourage folks to go take a look at it. It's got some really interesting insights. I think one of the takeaways that I have from the report is that there's varying degrees of understanding of how important empty miles are specifically to emissions. Can you talk about, Tyler and I always talk about efficiency, about how we can get that message across. And then I think the other part of it is people don't understand how they can tackle that problem specifically. So maybe those two things.
Yeah, that's a great call out. So yeah, one interesting thing in the report was that in terms of knowledge of empty miles, you really saw the highest knowledge and understanding of empty miles coming from the VP or the C-suite level. And I think one thing that we really want to focus on with our No Empty Miles campaign is to really bring broader awareness to not only the leadership, but also to the essentially the boots on the ground. So those are going to be the load planners and transportation managers, and really ensuring that not only do they think that it is a sustainability issue, but at the end of the day, their goal is they want to be able to get high quality capacity with low costs. And I think one of the unique things that we have with the opportunity to reducing empty miles is that it is a great way to also reduce costs within your supply chain. As you can imagine, with empty miles, a carrier is going to charge potentially a premium for extra waste in the supply chain, or again, underutilization of miles. So the fact that these load planners can potentially reduce empty miles, it's also going to reduce costs, make them make that budget stretch longer throughout the year.
How do we think about what empty miles means at large for really the industry? Putting some numbers behind what the contribution is towards emissions, and then also specifically when you're talking to your customers, how do they think about it's very early innings for folks to be setting ESG goals, right? We have conversations with firms. So you've got this global problem that is a national problem that becomes a corporate problem. And, it's been encouraging to see corporates take the initiative in setting goals ahead of regulation. And then, but I think in that conversation, because it's early innings, people, as they look at ESG, the E part of it, there's a lot of nuances inside there. And what we've heard a lot from shippers is that they understand transportation is important, but they don't yet feel like transportation's in the crosshairs. And so you kind of see that in the incentives or the lack of incentives for them to reduce, or for their network to reduce. So as you guys operate in the space and be advocates for empty miles, one, I think just trying to contextualize how big the problem is, empty miles, right, and then how firms are approaching it from an incentive perspective.
Yeah, and I think there's two big key things there. So I think one, with the road transportation sector specifically in the U.S., the U.S. road transportation sector is one of the highest polluting road transportation sectors in the world. So in terms of carbon emissions, so I do understand that people might think that sounds rather grave, but for me, and I think we look at it as a rather exciting opportunity in terms of sustainability, because Danny, I'm sure you would agree with this, but what that means for us is any basically improvement that you make to your supply chain in terms of reducing carbon emissions on the road, because we are a higher percentage all up of carbon emissions, any impact you make is going to be exponential. So to me, that's something exciting and something that the freight industry as a whole really can be at the forefront of in terms of making supply chains more sustainable. And two, another thing, I think a lot of industries you may see, if you want to make a commitment to improving sustainability or going after different sustainability goals, a lot of the time that comes with a rather significant capital investment. And I think the really unique thing about the reduction of empty miles is, one, not only if you reduce empty miles, do you have the potential to reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere, but then you also have the opportunity to reduce costs. So I think that's a really, really unique opportunity that we have with reducing empty miles, is rather than intensive capital investment to get to a sustainability goal, you can essentially reduce costs as well as reduce carbon emissions too.
What features do you guys have inside of your platform that allow your customers to take advantage of the opportunities?
Yeah, so the two biggest things that we really focus on are batching. So obviously, with us being a digital freight network, we have the ability to do essentially look at different networks and of shippers that we're working with, and batch loads that different drivers will be doing. So if a driver is doing a load from Seattle to LA, we can look at our network and essentially make sure that driver has a load back as he goes from LA back to Seattle. So we have batching, and then there's also we have this feature called green appointment windows, where we work with the shippers to basically optimize the pickup time for essentially making it green, meaning that rather than saying the driver has to be there at 11 a.m. on Thursday, we might work with the shipper to widen that gap to, let's say, maybe 8 hours. And what that has the potential to do is that might mean that the driver may not have to sit in traffic and idle and put extra carbon emissions, but he might be able to get there at, let's say, 7 a.m., which is going to be clearer on the road. So we have those features. I heard you talking about offsets right before I hopped on. We also work with carbonfund.org. So we're a big proponent of carbon offsets. But then to go on top of that, for our campaign around No Empty Miles, this is not necessarily about, hey, work with Convoy and we're going to be your sole solution to reduce empty miles. We really want to bring a sense of collaboration and partnership. And I think that is something that we heard in the report too, is that a lot of the shippers felt the only way to really start reducing those carbon emissions and get to those net zero goals is through collaboration. So we really love to see the different EV technology that's out there, the alternative fuel vehicle technology that's out there, carbon offsets. So we definitely feel that we are not a one-stop shop to necessarily, totally reduce carbon emissions in the supply chain, but we think we can definitely be a great partner in achieving those sustainability goals.
Yeah, and you guys are definitely walking the walk as well. You have joined our emissions working group that focuses on the collaboration piece, and I think for us, as we talk through how to address our problems, open lines of communication is going to be super important. We really appreciate you coming on. How can people get access to the report?
Yeah, so the report actually just went live this morning on FreightWaves. So should be on the sustainability section of freightwaves.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Danny.
Have a good one.